guys, welcome back to my channel. It is Tuesday, February 4th, and this video is about my experience judging the Octofinals round of the Booktube prize in 2025. So I was awarded these 6 books, and so I'm going to be starting with Knife, just because this is the book that I own. The publisher sent this to me, so thank you so much, Penguin Random House, for having sent me this gifted copy. I can start with this one while I wait for my other books to come in from the library. So next time you see me, I'll have some thoughts about this book. And it feels like kismet to start reading this book today, because the incident that inspired this book is actually in the news. I just heard it on the radio, as the perpetrator is currently on trial. So I'm gonna start reading with the news in the background. Finished reading Knife by Salman Rushdie. This one is subtitled Meditations After an Attempted Murder, and I really appreciated what he had to say in here about freedom of speech and some of the things that challenge our right and our opportunity of expressing ourselves, expressing our thoughts, our opinions, or fictionalizing the world as we see it. So a little background on Salman Rushdie. In 1988, I think it was, he published the Satanic Verses, and it was considered to be incendiary towards Muslim culture, and a fatwa was pronounced on him. So an entire regime pronounced a death threat on him and called for his assassination. And since that time, he's been living with that threat lingering, that someone is going to try to fulfill that fatwa. And in what year was it? 2022, August 12, 2022, a young man attacked him while he was about to speak, ironically, at an event to promote freedom of speech and the power of writing and power of words. And so in this book, Rushdie speaks about the challenges to freedom of expression, whether from individuals on online platforms like social media, people, leaving vile comments based on what you may have to say in a post, or as what happened to him, an entire regime pronouncing his book offensive and calling for violent reactions. So here Rushdie makes it personal. He talks about what happened to him. He gives us the nitty-gritty of his experience of being attacked and his slow recovery. Alongside his recovery, he talks about how the attack impacted his family members, but he also talks about very important writers of our time and some of the challenges to their continuing to write. The book includes a lot, and it is characteristic Rushdie writing because he's a fictional writer here writing nonfiction. He inhabits his fictional master's space, and he imagines a conversation with the young man who attacked him in 2022 and tries to get answers from this young man by inhabiting his mind, like the kind of mind space that would have led someone to attack him for words written in a book that the attacker had not read, because the young man who attacked him said he's never even read the Satanic Verses, but just being radicalized and feeling like someone who would write something that's offensive to the Muslim world must then be an enemy, and acting on that impulse. I liked the book. I liked what he had to say about freedom of expression, but I think there are parts of this book that are just really personal to Rushdie and what his experience was. And so as much as I think this is an important work, there may have been a little bit too much about his personal journey, his personal recovery from the attack. I wanted maybe something more about how the world in general suffers from the freedom of expression being threatened. So I like it, but I don't think it's going to be my favorite of the round. So we'll just have to see how the rest of the round shakes out. So it's Friday, February 7th, and I started reading The Bookshop by Evan Frist. This is a history of the American bookstore, and it is a history, not the history, because the author is tracing the American bookshop experience through certain stores. And I think he's trying to make it as singular as possible, but I'm sure that there are places in history that he doesn't explore as much as he focuses on others. What I'm really liking about the book so far is the focus that he is taking. So his history starts in an independent bookstore downtown Manhattan, and then he goes to the 1700s in Boston with Benjamin Franklin. And what I just finished reading right now was the Marshall Field department store in Chicago, specifically one woman who revolutionized the bookseller and like an indie bookstore within a bigger conglomerate. I'm really loving the focus. This was one of the books that I voted to be on the list of contenders for the Booktube Prize. So I'm happy that I did because I'm really enjoying this. I finished reading The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore by Evan Friss, and this was really fascinating reading. The author goes into an exploration of the history of the American book-selling community, why books are important for scholarly pursuits, for social community building, but also as politics and resistance and rebellion and change, and I loved it. So each chapter is an exploration of a different part of American history, and then the chapters are bookended by these much shorter, like 1 or 2 page essays that focus a little bit more on some of the ephemera connected with bookshops. There's an essay on the cat, or there's an essay called The Grandmother, which talked about a woman who was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who encouraged her children to read, and her children went on to found a bookshop and named it after her, called the R.J. Julia. There was just so much about this book that I really enjoyed. And one of the paragraphs that I found really meaningful was in his final essay, the actual final entry in the book, and he talks about why it is that romances, whether on the screen or in novels, are often set in bookshops or bookstores. And he says, bookstores can be romantic spaces, places full of discovery, of chance, of wonder. They can be community spaces, activist spaces, political spaces, and they can be refuges, places to lose and find oneself. Whether in mysteries or memoirs, travelogues or true crime tales, romances or rom-coms, horror or history, bookstores can be more than just passive backdrops. Bookstores can be actors. Bookstores, even the little ones, can shape the world around them. They already have. I love this book. I gave this 5 stars. This right now is the book to beat. Let's see if the others can stand up to it. I finished reading Roman Year, which is a memoir by Andre Aciman, which, if you're not familiar with Andre Aciman, he's the author of Call Me By My Name and other books. Homo Irrealis, Find Me, 8 White Nights Out of Egypt, False Papers, Alibis, Harvard Square, and Enigma Variations. He's also editor of the Proust Project, which a lot of those experiences that probably led to the titles of those books are mentioned here. So in this part of his memoir, he's recalling the time when he and his family are expelled from Alexandria, Egypt, and they are refugees in Italy. They live in Rome. They have this shoddy apartment, and how they come to be living in this shoddy apartment is that they have this mean uncle. He's more, I think, of a grand uncle to our author, but he's been in Italy for some years, and so the family has asked him to help them, get settled in their new circumstances. It is the author, his younger brother, and his mother, who is deaf. His father has stayed behind in Egypt trying to tie up his business affairs, but later we learn that the father doesn't really want to be with the mother. So they are, for all intents and purposes, estranged, even though they're still married. And so the father dips in and out of their lives, but even when he comes to stay with them temporarily in Rome, he then goes off and he has this other life. And it is about this boy settling in Rome, how he finds friends, his literary and sexual awakening is coming of age part of his life, but also how he takes responsibility for himself, takes responsibility for his mother's interactions, because like I said, she is deaf. And while she's a strong force in his life, she is not as strong and forceful in other social interactions. And so this young boy, he spends a lot of time kind of close to home. And so because of his background as a Jewish Egyptian now in Italy, and the time when he's there and a little bit of xenophobia, he's going to a school where he feels like an outsider and doesn't necessarily want to call attention to his difference. So he spends a lot of his time in social interactions pretending to be something. And so in his private space, he's seeking connection and feeling like there are limited opportunities to do that in real time. He makes connections with literary works and with the authors, these literary giants who he finds to be his compatriots in this foreign place. So It is about how literature helps him, how literature saves him, how literature opens up the world of opportunity for him. And so because we know that Andre Aciman goes on to be a successful author, it makes these literary connections that he's having that much more significant. And so I love how he talks about reading the books that his father read when he was a child, and even finding his father's journal from his childhood, and seeking connection with his father, but seeking these other like father figures in literature as well. I love that. And I like how he mentions these other pieces of literature and, just what they mean to him. And it becomes an exercise in what do these works also mean to you as a reader. So I really, really enjoyed this. I don't know that it will be my favorite of the round, but I really enjoyed reading it. I also listened to the audio as an accompaniment. That was a really good experience as well. So definitely would recommend this. So I finished my third book and now on to the fourth. So I finished Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose, and The Last Glory Days of Baseball by Keith O'Brien. I thought that this was really well done. I think the author did a really good job of making the story interesting enough, like staying true to the sports, but also making it immersive for someone who is not quite a sports fan. Like, I like to watch sport events, but when I compare myself to people who I call extreme fans, who they can quote batting averages and statistics from decades previously, I'm not a sports fan, but I found this to be quite readable. So of course we focus on Pete Rose's career, but we're also focusing on some of the things that are happening politically and socially around the same time. So Pete is born in the 1950s, and he's playing baseball at a time when the civil rights movement is going on. So we see what it's like for white players to be playing alongside Black and Latino athletes. We see some of the prejudice that persists even after segregation was abolished. So we have people who make statements like, we need white players for white fans to cheer for. And we also see some of the changes that are happening in the sports industry. So we see the beginning of free agency, we see endorsements, and athletes being paid to use their celebrity status to market products. We also see the increase in attention being given to football, and how football starts to eclipse baseball as the American sport. A lot of that is happening here, and I thought that the author did a really good job of highlighting Pete Rose's career, but also showing other things that were happening at the same time. And while a lot of the focus on this book is on his rise, we also get a little bit of the fall. We see how his sports achievements get eclipsed by his gambling, and what are some of the consequences for him as well as other players when that starts to unfold. I thought that this was really well done. As surprising as this may be, this is not one of my top books for this category, so I still have 2 more books to read, and we'll see how the rankings shake out then. Stay tuned. So I'm going to be honest. I started reading Share the Memoir Part 1 just because it's been assigned to me. I had absolutely no interest in reading a celebrity memoir, but this writing, I'm just 2 chapters in, and already the writing is just so captivating. In these first couple of chapters, Cher is focusing on the earliest origins of her family that she can remember. And so we're learning about her great-grandparents and her grandmother, who were Native Americans, or as she calls them, original people in the South, and then how her mother was a naturally gifted singer. And then later, when Cher herself is born and her mother is not able to take care of her, how she is taken to this Catholic charity where they would allow parents to leave their children for some time and go off and figure out what they're doing so that they could come back and reclaim the child. But that in this case, because her father had vanished, they were reluctant to give this child back to a single mom. And how, if not for someone powerful intervening, Cher, or as she was known back then, Sherilyn, would have been possibly adopted or grown up in an orphanage. But even from the earliest part of this book, we can see that there is this strong bond between Cher, the child Cher, and her mother. And you know me, if you've been watching my channel for some time, you know I love reading books about daughters and their mothers in any kind of iteration. So already I am just so captivated by this book. I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of it. It is not short. It is over 400 pages long, and I am only at page 23, but already I'm invested. One other thing. So you know how usually on the inside back cover of the hardcover, usually you have a bio, most times accompanied by an author photo. This one simply says, Cher is a global icon. If you don't know who Cher is, what are you doing reading this book? I guess is what that says. I'm loving it. I'm updating my reading journal because I just finished reading Cher the Memoir, Part 1. And I found this to be insanely readable, really immersive. I just really love the conversational tone that Cher employs in sharing her life story. And she doesn't start necessarily with her trajectory to stardom. She starts with her mother's story. As a child, just out of toddlerhood, the grandfather was taking her to dive bars so that she could sing. And so this woman, Jackie Jean, who becomes Cher's mother, tried really hard for a really long time to make it in Hollywood, to make it as an actress and as a singer. And it just makes Cher's story that much more engaging because, you know, we know that Cher becomes a superstar that the grandfather wanted his daughter to become. And so Cher lives out her mother's dream. And the fact that Jackie Jean was such a young mother, she almost grows up along with Cher. And so Cher in this memoir recalls a time when she's about to perform and she invites her mother and the grandfather to come and see her on stage. And so she's recounting this thing that she probably didn't witness herself, but that was told to her. She says when she's up there with all the lights and all the attention and everybody's focused on Cher performing, the grandfather, Grandpa Roy, shakes Jackie Jean and says, "That's you." Like, that was the dream, that was the vision. And it just becomes this fulfillment of this dream. And I love this. I love this for Cher, that she became the success that her mother wanted to be, but also that her mother wanted her to be. And so I loved it. I love how she tells her story, even though there are parts of her story that are very difficult to read about, and also I'm sure would have been very difficult for her to have lived, because a big part of Cher's success, a big part of Cher's stardom was linked to Sonny Bono. And she met Sonny Bono when she was a 16-year-old and Sonny was 27. He's 11 years older than she is. And so she essentially grew out of adolescence and into adulthood and into her stardom with their destinies linked. And there's just so much about this story. Like, I want to tell you all about it, but I also want you to read it. As much as I really, really love this book and I want to come back for the part 2, I don't think that this is the book that's going to win my round. I love this, but I don't think it is the book that is representative of the Booktube prize for the entire year. I don't know. Judging is the hard part. Reading the books and being entranced by them is definitely the easy part of the round. I'm not sure how to weigh this along with the other 5 books, but even now, I don't think it's in my top 3. That's so hard to say because I really, really enjoyed this. And as much as this is a story about Cher's life, her rise to stardom, and her relationship with her husband and her child, because we see her daughter, who became a transgender individual, we see the birth of that child. All of that happens here. But it's also a really important historical marker because the fact that this part of the story is unfolding in the 1960s and 70s, we see some of the political changes as well as changes in the acting and music industries, and the impact of celebrity endorsements on political campaigns. So in here she records like things that were happening when JFK died, the fact that they had an album coming out on the same day that JFK died, and so their album tanked because, you know, news coverage was just focused on the fact that the president had been shot. And then later how she and Sonny were endorsing Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, as a political candidate, and how he was also assassinated and how they related to that. She talks about like her experience with fur, how at first she was given a fur coat that she really loved and that now she is a staunch PETA supporter. She's recording all these political changes as well as telling her life story. And I found that to be so smart, so engaging, just so readable. Highly recommend this one. It does give you a little bit of a snapshot into the past as it was lived by one person, 1 star. Not that the book is 1 star. So right now I'm at chapter 4 in 3 Shades of Blue by James Kaplan, and I am loving that this is music history. It's also cultural history, and we're getting a little bit of the personal history of these musicians. Like Miles Davis is the person we're focusing on right now, and we're seeing some of his experience. A legitimate move to New York to pursue a music education at Juilliard School of Music, and how he is supported in his decision to leave Juilliard and pursue a professional career, even though it must have been quite a departure from his parents' dream for him. Showing that they fully supported him. I'm really loving that. Like, it's just this little piece of black joy. James Kaplan does a really fantastic job of distinguishing these characters, but also showing the connection between them. So we're reading about Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, and these are not names that I knew them separately. Like, I'm familiar with the names, but here we're getting an opportunity to see what makes them different as people, but also as musicians, and I'm loving it. I finished James Kaplan's book 3 Shades of Blue, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and the Lost Empire of Cool, and I loved it. I thought that this was such a representative book of history, of Black history, of music culture, about politics, about the times of the 1950s and 60s specifically, some of the changes in America that led to the birth of this music genre, and also the impact of the music, what it meant for the people who were producing the music, whether it was the musicians or their producers or the people who hosted events at clubs, and just all the people who went into the production of this music and this time. Also the impact that this music had and continues to have on the world. Reading a book like this and thinking about the experience that these musicians lived through while they were producing this fantastic music is just, it was just beautifully recorded in this book. If it was one thing about the book that I didn't like, it was how much the author talked about the drug addiction that a lot of these musicians dealt with. But he wasn't making it up. Like, it's not fiction. He was just reporting, you know, the times that we were living in. And even here, because a lot of the musicians that we're reading about were African Americans, there is discussion about whether or not the drug use by African American musicians was higher than drug use by musicians of different racial backgrounds, or whether it was just skewed in terms of how it was reported. So I think the author does a really good job of capturing the essence of the times, but also leaving it to the reader to maybe sift through some of the things that you rather not focus on. Addiction was a really big part of the music culture, and so I understand why it is included here. I just, you know, I'd really rather not read about it, but I also like the fact that he shows how one, that some of these artists use drugs to enhance their performance, whether it was to take the edge off, allow them to perform, or just allow them to focus based on the effects of the narcotics. I think the author does a really good job of portraying this music, portraying this time, and making it readable, making it approachable to the casual reader. So you don't have to be a jazz fan in order to want to read this book and experience this culture. So as someone who has never been mistaken as a jazz fan, it was really interesting to read the mechanics of the music and to learn about the classical undertones in music that sometimes may be considered to be Black music. It was just really interesting to read about the birth and development of this musical genius and the people who may have otherwise been sidelined, and to realize the genius that was being produced by these people even in the heights of their addiction. Man, it was just so interesting to read, and I hope everyone will want to experience this. So looking back at the round thus far, I think this is going to be one of my top books. Let me think. It is submission day, and these are the books, and this is how I'm ranking them. My number 6 place is Roman Year by Andre Aciman, which is ironic because I just reserved tickets to go hear him talk about this book. I admired it. I guess as much as I enjoyed hearing about him, I wanted more of the context of why this why this part of his life happened. In fifth place for me is Cher, the Memoir, Part 1. I enjoyed reading about the beginning of her career, as well as reading about her mother's start in the show business and the music business, and why it was just so important for Cher to make it. But ultimately, I felt like this was more niche. Like, you had to want to know more about Cher to really enjoy this. So I felt like it probably wouldn't appeal to the wider audience, even though Cher is a mega superstar and probably most people want to hear her story. But yeah, still in fifth place for me. I struggled with this one because I could see why this would be an absolute favorite. But, you know, ultimately, this was such a strong round for me that I had to start splitting hairs. I really enjoyed reading Knife by Salman Rushdie, Meditations After an Attempted Murder. I really enjoyed his ruminations on what happened to him, as well as what it means to the larger literary world. About freedom of speech, and I felt like this was really important. But because the book is so short and it focuses on his experience, it felt a little bit more like his story and not the wider story. So this round up in fourth place for me. Third place is Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. I am just as surprised, if not more surprised than you are, that a book about a sports icon is in my third spot, and it is one of the books that I am suggesting and hoping will move forward. But while this was about Pete Rose's story, it was also about baseball history and sports history, because, you know, the author incorporated a lot of the changes that were happening in baseball that resulted in Pete Rose's rise, but also in his fall. I really enjoyed how the author tackled the subject of sports, not just one sports figure. So that was my third place book. And similarly, this book about jazz and music culture in the 1950s and 60s, well, 40s, 50s, 60s, and some of these musicians, the ones who lived long enough to tell the tale in the 70s and 80s and even present day. I really enjoyed how the author portrayed these musicians and gave us a little bit of a deep dive into a few musicians and their addictions, but also the beauty of the music. There was a chance that this could have been my number one book, but I felt like there were some mixed messages about drug use. Really enjoyed what the author had to say about people who could have fallen down or stayed down, but how some of them were able to rise above the call of addiction, prejudice, and some of the things that were happening in the music industry that would have impeded their musical career, but that the focus was just really on the music. And I really enjoyed this one. So 3 Shades of Blue, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and the Lost Empire of Cool by James Kaplan is my number 2 book. And my number 1 spot, the first book that I read, and maybe that's why, but I thought that this was just such a great look at the change in the book world. The things that have changed and also the things that have stayed the same, the love for books, and how people have sometimes dedicated themselves to just honoring books, even if it meant sacrificing personal or financial gain, honoring literature, honoring the community that bookstores and bookshops have afforded us. And so this is still my number 1 book, The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore by Evan Friss. Who knows how the round will shake out, but these are my thoughts. This was my submission. So I look forward to chatting with you. If you watched the Booktube Prize official reveal, and if you're following the prize, would love to know what you thought about my submission. So thank you so much for watching this entire video if you did. And I look forward to chatting with you about the books in the comments. So thank you so much. And until we come back for another video, happy reading. Bye.